Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. In the last video I spoke about the mistakes that Benater made in his debate with Jordan Peterson. I will talk about the mistakes that Jordan made.
Because I've thought very much about, it's not as if I think that the arguments that you're making are somehow trivial. And I don't want to give that impression. And I don't want to go discuss the arguments that you're making in a way that casually dismisses them for methodological reasons, even though I think there are methodological flaws. I would say that your argument flies in the face of the deepest human judgment, and here's my logic for that. So if you have a child and you're acutely aware of their potential for suffering, let's say they're 3 or 4 years old, and you know that they can be damaged in all sorts of terrible ways, partly by the force of the natural world, and partly by the force of the social world, and partly by individual human malevolence, then you're of course terrified for their fragility. And then you might say, well, because that fragility is such an awful burden, it would have perhaps been better never to engender it to begin with. And then I might say, well, do you really believe that? And I would say the answer to that is, well, do you love the child or not in the deepest sense? And if the answer to that is that you do, then I would say that with the entire force of your being, rather than with your mere rational mind, which is attempting to do a faux quantitative analysis, then the love that you express for someone who's fragile and subject to malevolence is the decision at the deepest part of your being that their being is fundamentally good, despite the fact of its subjugation to tragedy and malevolence. So I've tried very hard to put a crowbar underneath that argument, see if I could flip it in an anti-natalist direction, and it's not evident. And I could say the same thing with my elderly father. Like, he's starting to fall apart, and he's very painfully aware of that, as is everyone around him. And I might say, well, are there steps that I would take to eradicate his vulnerability such that he would no longer be subject to that sort of decay? And the answer to that is, well, as you eradicate vulnerabilities and attempt to redress them so that that suffering is no longer an existential reality, then you start to dismantle the very elements of the being that you actually happen to respect and admire and love.
To be fair to Jordan, this is a fairly good argument because it can't really be debunked. When it comes to most arguments, they are based on rationality, and therefore you are able to either debunk the premises or by some act of modus tollens or modus ponens are able to debunk the rationale that they took in order to end up at that point. However, here Jordan says in the premise that this argument is not rational but rather emotional, which is something that cannot be debunked. It would be the same as someone saying to you that they feel cold, and then you say to them that they don't actually feel cold but instead feel warm. You are not able to experience their individual experience of heat and cold, in the same way that none of us are able to experience Peterson's feeling of love. However, putting that aside, there are some problems here with what Jordan is saying. There are a number of well-known features of human psychology that can account for the favorable assessment people usually make of their own life's quality. It is these psychological phenomena rather than the actual quality of life that explain the positive assessment. The first being the Pollyanna principle, a tendency toward optimism. This manifests in many ways. First, there is an inclination to recall positive rather than negative experiences. For example, when asked to recall events from throughout their lives, subjects in a number of studies listed a much greater number of positive than negative experiences. The second being that very few people describe themselves as not too happy. Instead, the overwhelming majority claims to be either pretty happy or very happy. Indeed, most people believe that they are better off than most others or than the average person. And the third being habituation. When a person's objective well-being takes a turn for the worse, there is, at first, a significant subjective dissatisfaction. However, there is a tendency then to adapt to the new situation and to adjust one's expectations accordingly. Even if we were to think about this from an evolutionary standpoint, it would be most logical that we have an innate drive to want to continue living, as any being that did not desire to live, would be a genetic dead end, and an evolutionary failure. It is likely that these, at least in part, are the reasons why Michaelia would have chosen to live her life over again. Also, anti-natalism isn't inherently pro-suicide, but we are not anti-suicide either. It's best left to the discretion of the individual if they are still able to make such a decision.
Well, if you assume that, and this gets us back to our initial problem, which is that the bad and the good can be arithmetically set against one another, and that there's some sort of finitude of measurement in relationship to that. And that brings me to another point of contention, which is that there are various ways of conducting yourself in the world. And so you can't necessarily make generalizations about the quality of being across beings. The more profound pro-natalist, let's say, responses to the fact of suffering in the world say something like the manner in which suffering should be confronted is a matter of personal, let's say character, and that there are modes of being in the world that justify being. And this is where I think the argument that you're making is most severely, flawed. So if we accept the conclusion that there's a tremendous amount of suffering associated with individual being and tremendous subjection to malevolence, the question emerges not whether or not being is worth, is something that can be judged worthwhile, but which modes of being might be judged worthwhile. And part of the reason that I've been so attracted to, say, archetypal psychology is because archetypal psychology lays out a path of being, which is something like voluntary confrontation with tragedy and malevolence, and notes that that's a pathway that produces a quality of being that transcends the suffering and limits the malevolence. And so it isn't that life is something that you can quantify and then compare, because there are modes of life that are qualitatively different, and you can't compare across them in a quantitative manner. So there are modes of being that justify existence, and that's basically the grounds for what you might describe as ethics.
Modes of being that justify existence are dwarfed by all modes of non-being, as non-being does not have to justify existence, and is still a preferable experience, or a preferable non-experience when compared with existence, because happiness is the lack of desire, pain is desire in excess, that which is never born desires nothing, therefore it does not suffer, whereas all living things always desire something, therefore they are always in a form of suffering.
So the voluntary confrontation with tragedy and malevolence that you speak about, that's voluntary for the person that already exists. They exist, they find this world around them, and now they voluntarily confront it in one way rather than another way. But nobody is voluntarily confronting existence per se, in the sense of having chosen to exist. That's something that's imposed on us by others. And I'm asking why we justified in making this imposition. I think if we agree, as we are for the sake of argument, that there's more bad in life than good, why would you possibly create a being that then has to confront that?
Well, it's funny that the way that you phrase the question, shows implicitly the manner in which you expect and structure the answer. You said, well, why would we impose the necessity of being on someone who hasn't chosen it? Might say, well, I could also rephrase the question and say, well, it's an offer of an opportunity rather than an imposition of a dreadful fate. I mean, the fact that you regard it as an imposition of a dreadful fate in the manner in which you posed the question indicates that the conclusion is implicit in the premise. Like, I have a granddaughter now, and I would say, well, she's been offered the opportunity to exist. And you'd say, well, no, that was inflicted upon her, but that begs the question. Well, I wouldn't say it was inflicted upon her.
Jordan's granddaughter here wasn't offered the option to exist, it was forced on her. There was no discussion before conception into whether or not she wanted to be born. Jordan's daughter and son-in-law decided they wanted a baby, and they had one. That is the beginning and end of the story, no more no less. Thank you for watching, and say what you want me to respond to in the comments.